Chapter number 6. Colonialism, Urbanization and De-urbanization. In pre-British India, towns and cities flourished around royal courts, craft centers, crossroads of trade routes and places of pilgrimage. However, with the advent of the British, many Sultanate and Mughal-era towns and cities lost prominence to the newly established British cities such as Bombay, Madras and Calcutta. Thus, the process of urbanization and de-urbanization is closely linked to the rise and decline of kingdoms. Urbanization and de-urbanization. With the coming of the Delhi Sultans and Mughals, there was revival of urbanization process in the medieval ages. They developed new trading and manufacturing centers, while some emerged as centers of learning under the patronage of the rulers. Capital cities of medieval rulers emerged as important administrative and economic centers. Some of the most important cities established by the Delhi Sultans and the Mughal emperors were Agra, Hisar, Firozabad and Fatehpur Sikri. With the weakening of the Mughal Empire, political scenario underwent a drastic change, and this led to decline of many prominent trading centers and cities. In the late 18th century, along with the rise of presidencies, important administrative centers of colonial India, several other cities in India experienced large-scale de-urbanization. During colonial era, handloom and handicraft industries declined as the English turned India into a ready market for their cheap machine-made goods. As a result, centers specializing in handmade indigenous goods such as Decca or Dhaka in present-day Bangladesh and Murshidabad declined. Moreover, with the fall of the patrons of luxury goods, even towns specializing in manufacturing them faded away. With the shifting of political and economic activities to newly established administrative centers, old ports and trading centers were de-urbanized. Growth of new towns and cities. Gradually, in different parts of India, new towns and cities developed after the decline of the old towns and cities. These new urban centers can be broadly classified under the following categories. Port cities. Port cities were the most important centers of British trading activities. From Calcutta, Bombay and Madras, raw materials were sent to Britain. Similarly, British finished goods, including Lancashire cotton, entered India mainly through these ports. These ports also played a key role in further distribution of British goods to different parts of India. Non-coastal cities. These newly emerged cities were strategically located. Some of these cities, such as New Delhi, rose to prominence mainly as a center of administration and Mughal Sarai as an important railway junction. Hill stations. All the credit for developing our hill stations goes to the British. They developed hill stations such as Dalhousie, Shimla, Mussoorie, Darjeeling and Ooty to escape the hot and humid weather of the plains. The most well-known and prominent hill station was Shimla. It was Shimla from where the British government conducted its affairs for a part of a year during the summer months. The basic idea was to establish a place where they could recover from the heat and diseases of the plains. They constructed churches, malls, and central avenues, which reflected the influence of English architectural tradition. The hill stations were special retreats for the English and accentuated the difference between Europeans and Indians. Records reveal that with the beginning of summers in India, most of the British officers moved to hill stations, Shimla, Mussoorie, Nainital, Darjeeling or Ooty. Cantonments. The British also developed cantonments based on European plan with broad roads, huge open spaces and separate residential and office areas. Lansdowne in Uttarakhand and Danapur in Patna are examples of cantonment towns established during the British period. These were generally a little away from the main city, where the families of the armed forces resided. Wonderful to know. Abul Fazl, the court historian of Mughal Emperor Akbar, writes that there were around 2,800 towns in 1594. Larger villages were converted into towns. From the 14th century onwards, these became significant centers of crafts and mercantile as well as commercial transactions. Old and the new urban centers. Differences. The colonial towns were different from the early Indian towns. Now, let us examine the major differences between the traditional Indian towns, cities and the new ones that sprang up during the British rule. Urban centers before the British. Many of the Indian towns and cities were called walled cities because they were enclosed within fort walls and surrounded by a deep moat. The walls and moats were meant to protect the city from invaders. The walls of the fort were usually thick and high. These fort towns had darwazas, that is, huge gates that were the entry points to the city. The cities were usually divided into wards or thanas. These wards were further subdivided into mohallas or neighborhoods. For example, in the 18th century, the city of Delhi had about 600 mohallas and 18 thanas. An instance of Shahjahanabad, a walled city built during Shah Jahan's time. The city consisted of 14 entry points, a palace complex, Red Fort, and Asia's largest mosque, Jama Masjid, located in the midst of crowded mohallas and bazaars. Besides, the city was dotted with gardens, eidgahs, dargahs, chowks, that is open squares, and cul-de-sacs. Another significant feature of this city was its havelis or houses of the rich. High thick walls with skillfully made massive gateways enclosed the havelis. Besides, they comprised big central courtyards with several rooms, pavilions, and well-maintained gardens and water channels. Administration. Administrative system of the urban areas was quite different from that of rural areas. In the villages, panchayat system was followed, while the in charge of the town was kotwal with thanadars, supervising the mohalladars and darogas or policemen. Armed watchmen were positioned near the fort's entry point. The new urban centers. The British introduced a new architectural style in India. In terms of size, The new urban centers were quite big, with broad roads and big open spaces in the form of towns, playgrounds and parks. Public buildings were also large and the construction was good. The British residential buildings, called bungalows, were designed for nuclear families. Bungalows were usually huge and single-storied houses with gardens, verandas and wide windows. The servant quarters and stable were at times situated within the same compound, but separate from the house. Towns under the British in India consisted of facilities like racecourse, golf course, club or a gymnasium, meant for the amusement of the Europeans only. However, some influential and rich Indians were granted limited access. Some cities, such as Madras, were divided into two parts: White Town, in which British lived, and Black Town, where the locals lived. The black and white towns were separated by a wall. These new localities and new cities were given typical English names. Administration. In these new cities, the British introduced a new form of administration. Lord Cornwallis, the Governor-General of India from 1786 to 93, introduced a new code of regulations known as the Cornwallis Code in the year 1793. The district collector slowly emerged as the most important official in the local administration. In the urban areas, the municipality was in charge of public health, sanitation, lighting, sewage, parks and roads. In India, the oldest municipal corporation is in Madras. It was created in December 1687 by a royal charter issued by King James II of England. As per Act XXVI of 1850, a municipal government was responsible for administering a major town. The Municipal Improvement Act was introduced in the year 1864. The chairman of the municipality was district magistrate, who was assisted by commissioners. The commissioners were selected from the responsible and popular residents of the city. The municipality's main source of revenue were bazaar tax, road tax and tax on ferries. Lord Dalhousie established the Public Works Department that was responsible for constructing and repairing roads, bridges and canals. This department repaired the Grand Trunk Road, linking Calcutta, that is Kolkata, with Peshawar. Law and order. Lord Cornwallis also established a regular police force to maintain the law and order. The Indian Penal Code was framed in 1860 under Lord Macaulay that listed out different categories of criminals. The Indian Police Act of 1861 concluded the final changes. The new police department was headed by an Inspector General of Police who was assisted by the Deputy Inspector General, the Assistant District Superintendent of Police, the Inspector, the Head Constable, the Sergeant and Constables. A complete jail code was also prepared. The main objective of the police reform was to set up a uniform and effective police administration in the country. Transport and communication. The British ruler realized the importance of cheap and easy means of transport to reach the nooks and corners of the country. Lord Dalhousie proposed a network of 4 main trunk lines to connect the interior of the country with major ports. By 1869, more than 4,000 miles of rail track had been laid. By 1906, the country had nearly 30,000 miles of railway track. Postal and telegraph system. The introduction of railways played a major role in the establishment of an efficient and modern post and telegraph system in India. The first telegraph line from Calcutta, that is Kolkata, to Agra was inaugurated in 1853. Lord Dalhousie also introduced the use of postage stamps. Architectural phase of New Delhi. New Delhi, constructed in 1911 on Raisina Hill, was inaugurated in 1931 as the capital of British India. The main buildings constructed were the Viceroy's Palace, now Rashtrapati Bhavan, Council Chamber, now Parliament House, the North Block and the South Block, India Gate, Connaught Place, and several public buildings. Government buildings were mostly constructed with the red and buff-colored sandstone. The prominent features of these new buildings were domes, logias, chhajjas, chhatris, and jalis borrowed from ancient and medieval architecture. The Secretariat building that has important government offices was designed by Baker. Lutyens designed the India Gate, the Parliament House, and the Viceroy's Palace. The India Gate was built in the memory of soldiers who laid down their lives in the First World War. Designed by Edward Lutyens, it is 42 meter high and built from red Bharatpur sandstone. The Parliament House is a huge circular colonnaded building. Our Parliament functions from this building. The official residence of the President of India, Rashtrapati Bhavan, is located in the heart of New Delhi. Before independence, it was the residence of the British Viceroy to India. Built in the year 1929, it is spread over about 330 acres and consists of 340 rooms. Mughal Garden, to the west of this building, is a huge garden, specially known for its rare roses, including black roses. Case Study: Delhi. Delhi, the capital of India, is one of the oldest cities in the world, which has been continuously inhabited. In the past, it has been the capital of several mighty empires. Several monuments present on the landscape of Delhi speak about its history. Even before the British made New Delhi their capital, Delhi seems to have been the site of 7 cities. In the early part of the 19th century, culture and literature prospered and the British lived along the affluent Indians within the walled city. The Delhi College that began as Madrasa, established in 1792, prospered as a center of learning in the field of science and humanities. In fact, the period on the eve of revolt of 1857 is often referred to as Delhi Renaissance. However, after suppressing the revolt and the exile of Bahadur Shah, a military cantonment was set up in Delhi by demolishing pavilions and forts, clearing gardens around the fort and filling up the water channels. Later, the western wall of Shahjahanabad was demolished to expand the city and lay down the railway line. The British now lived in the civil lines area, away from the crowded walled city. To assert their supremacy, the British even organized a Grand Darbar in Delhi in 1877. In December 1911, King George V was crowned in England, and a darbar was held in Delhi to celebrate the event. The decision to shift the capital to Delhi was also announced. Sir Edwin Lutyens and Sir Herbert Baker were the two great architects who designed New Delhi. New Delhi was designed to be a city with gardens, broad roads, fountains, parks, and big government office buildings and mansions. Unlike the old city, New Delhi definitely had better water supply, sewage disposal, and drainage facilities. The colonial era bungalows, unlike the Havelis, were single-story structures set amid 1 or 2 acres of open land. The architecture of the city was a combination of Western classical elements with traditional Hindu and Islamic architecture. The old city. As the new city grew in a planned manner, the old city fell into neglect. While the excellent water supply and drainage system of the Mughal era broke down, the population of the city continued to grow rapidly. By the end of the 19th century, open surface drains replaced underground sewer, but they too were insufficient. Even the Baolis or wells in course of time fell into disuse. The grand Havelis, which used to be the pride of the old city, began to collapse. Many Mughal-era affluent classes, unable to maintain such large establishments, began to sell off portions of their Havelis. The mercantile class purchased some, while others turned into ruins. Often shops or warehouses sprang up on the street in front of the Havelis. To decongest the old city, in 1888, Robert Clark put forward a scheme called Lahori Gate Improvement Scheme. As per this scheme, a new type of market square was to be developed and the streets were to be laid out in a grid pattern. However, Clarkganj, as it was called, failed to achieve its objective. In 1936, the Delhi Improvement Trust was set up and it introduced different housing plans for people of different economic backgrounds. For instance, Daryaganj was meant for the affluent classes. This area was divided into blocks and houses were developed around parks. Delhi after the partition. In 1947, India was partitioned and Pakistan was created. A large number of people from both sides migrated across the borders. The refugees occupied homes vacated by the Muslims, while some found shelter in refugee camps established by the Government of India. The others had to live in temples, gurudwaras, colleges, schools, military barracks, and even on the streets. The large-scale migration changed the social setting of Delhi. New colonies such as Lajpat Nagar, Tilak Nagar, and many more came up. Shops, businesses, schools, and colleges also emerged in order to meet the demands of the migrant population. In recent times too, Delhi has undergone major changes in its original character. Many old British period buildings have been demolished, substantially enlarged or renovated. To cater to the needs of a growing population, new constructions have been done in the form of commercial and residential buildings. However, heritage lovers and environmentalists are against such large-scale modern constructions that decrease the architectural and historical value of the city. In other parts of the world during that time, Herbert Baker was the dominant force in South African architecture for 2 decades, from 1892 to 1912. He journeyed to South Africa in 1892, apparently to visit his brother, and was commissioned by Cecil Rhodes, who was the governor of Cape Town. He further inspired Baker towards the British Empire. He designed the Union Building in the city of Pretoria in South Africa. He also built the Secretariat Building in New Delhi, which contains elements of classical architecture. Both the buildings were constructed to house imperial officers.